May 14, 1943. Solomon Islands, ****. The air above the jungle canopy still trembles with the ghost of propeller thunder. Beneath the twisted wreckage of a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, half buried in volcanic soil and strangled by vines already reclaiming what man had torn through the sky, an American Marine corporal named Eddie Devlin crouches in the mud. His rifle rests against a shattered wing panel painted with the rising sun, now faded and scorched. The smell is overwhelming. Aviation fuel, burned rubber, and something else, something organic and final that he tries not to name. He doesn't want to be here. None of them do. But orders are orders, and intelligence officers want everything. Maps, code books, technical manuals, anything that might give them an edge in this grinding war of attrition across thousands of miles of ocean. Devlin's hands, still shaking from the morning's firefight 3 ridges over, pull open the remnants of a leather satchel. Inside, no military secrets. No encryption keys or invasion plans. Just a small book bound in cloth, its pages soft with humidity and spotted with rain. He opens it carefully. The script is Japanese, brushstrokes he cannot read, flowing down the page like water over stones. But there are photographs tucked between the pages. A young woman in a kimono. 2 small children holding paper kites. A family standing before a wooden gate with cherry blossoms overhead. Devlin closes the journal and looks at the cockpit, at what remains of the pilot still strapped inside, and something turns in his chest. For a moment, the enemy becomes a man. A son. A father. Someone who carried these faces into battle as a talisman against the dark. The war in the Pacific was not clean. From the frozen hills of Manchuria to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, from the Burma jungle to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, this was a conflict fought without quarter, without mercy, and often without witnesses. The Japanese warrior code, Bushido, demanded absolute commitment, victory or death, honor preserved through sacrifice, shame erased only through obliteration. For the young men of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, surrender was not merely defeat. It was spiritual annihilation, a betrayal of emperor, ancestors, and nation. They had been raised in a culture that venerated the samurai, that taught them the 47 Ronin were not tragic figures but paragons of loyalty. To be captured alive was to become Furio, a prisoner, but more than that, a ghost, a man without honor, a living embodiment of failure. And so they fought with a ferocity that stunned their American adversaries. They flew their planes into ships, turned their bodies into weapons, died in caves rather than raise their hands. The Americans, in turn, learned to expect no surrender, to trust no white flag, to kill or be killed in a theater of war where the rules of Geneva seemed written for another world entirely. This was industrial warfare given a face, brutal, intimate, and unforgiving. But wars are not fought only with bullets and bombs. They are fought with ideas, with images of the enemy, with the stories soldiers tell themselves to justify the killing. The Japanese pilot in his cockpit believed he flew for a divine emperor, for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would liberate Asia from Western imperialism, for a Japan that had been humiliated and constrained by Washington naval treaties and trade embargoes. He had been told that Americans were soft, materialistic, without spiritual strength, that they would break when faced with Japanese determination. He had been told that this was a holy war, a righteous war, a war Japan could not afford to lose. He did not expect to find, in the wreckage of his own certainty, evidence of the enemy's humanity. He did not expect kindness. He certainly did not expect his journal to come home. The practice began quietly, almost accidentally, in the early months of the Pacific Campaign. Intelligence officers sorting through captured materials at forward bases noticed the prevalence of personal diaries among Japanese casualties. In Japanese military culture, keeping a journal was common, not mandated, but widespread, a way to process the extremity of war, to maintain connection with the self when everything else was chaos. Soldiers and pilots wrote about homesickness, fear, boredom, the beauty of a sunset over enemy territory, the taste of rice gone bad, the faces of comrades killed in the last engagement. They wrote poetry. They copied Buddhist sutras. They sketched the aircraft they flew, the ships they served on, the distant mountains of islands whose names they barely knew. American intelligence initially valued these journals for operational information, unit designations, morale assessments, details about equipment and tactics. But officers fluent in Japanese, many of them second-generation Japanese Americans serving in the military intelligence service despite the internment of their families back home, noticed something else as they translated page after page. These were not the writings of fanatics. These were the confessions of young men far from home, terrified and brave in equal measure, sustained by duty and love and the hope of return. The translators found themselves moved, unsettled, reminded that the enemy, too, bled and doubted and dreamed. A captain named Thomas Hosehide, born in Honolulu, educated in California, now serving with the 43rd Infantry Division, made a recommendation to his superiors in the summer of 1943. The journals containing no intelligence value, those filled only with personal reflection, family correspondence, poems, and sketches, should be preserved. Not destroyed. Not discarded into the mud. Preserved, catalogued, and when possible, returned to the families of the fallen. It was a radical idea in the middle of a war characterized by mutual demonization, by atrocity and reprisal, by bombs dropped on cities and prisoners executed in jungle clearings. But Hosehide argued from pragmatism as much as compassion. If the Japanese people saw that Americans treated their dead with respect, treated their personal effects with care, it might crack the narrative they had been fed about Western barbarism. It might make surrender thinkable. It might save lives. His superiors, skeptical but intrigued, authorized a limited program. Journals and personal photographs would be collected, tagged with the location and date of recovery, and stored. After the war, if there was an after, they would be returned through neutral channels. The pilots and soldiers who had written these journals expected them to burn with their bodies. They expected them to sink into the ocean or rot in the jungle, consumed by insects and time. They never imagined that their most intimate thoughts would be read by the enemy, translated by Americans who understood every nuance of longing and despair, and then, impossibly, sent home. Lieutenant Junior Grade Fumio Takai kept his journal in a repurposed navigation logbook. Shot down during a reconnaissance mission over Bougainville in October 1943, his Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber clipped the trees during an emergency landing and cartwheeled into a ravine. American soldiers from the 37th Infantry Division found the wreckage 2 days later. Takai's body, thrown from the cockpit, lay face down in a stream. In his flight suit pocket, the logbook. 147 pages, written in meticulous hand, dating back to his training days at Kasumigaura Air Corps. The translator who first read Takai's journal, a Nisei linguist named George Yamada, later wrote in his own diary that it was the most difficult assignment of his life. Not because of the language, Takai wrote in clear, standard Japanese, but because of the content. Page after page, Takai documented his transformation from idealistic naval cadet to exhausted, disillusioned warrior. He wrote about his wedding 2 months before Pearl Harbor, to a woman named Keiko whom he barely knew, an arrangement made by their families. He wrote about his shame at being happy when the war began because it meant purpose, glory, a chance to prove himself. He wrote about the first time he attacked an enemy ship, the Americans on deck visible through his bomb sight, and how he vomited into his oxygen mask afterward. He wrote about the taste of their rations, rice infested with weevils, canned meat that might have been pork or dog. They joked, though no one laughed. He wrote about the day his closest friend, a pilot named Ichiro, went down off Guadalcanal, and how he could still hear Ichiro's voice over the radio, calm and steady, saying he couldn't maintain altitude, that the engine was gone, that he would make a water landing. And then silence. Static. And Takai, still flying, still alive, circling once over the spot where the ocean swallowed his friend, before turning back to base because his fuel was low. In the final entries, written days before his death, Takai's tone shifted. He stopped writing about tactics and missions. He wrote instead to Keiko, though he knew she would never read these words. He told her about the clouds over the Coral Sea, how they formed mountains of light at dawn. He told her he was sorry for being a stranger in their brief marriage. He told her he hoped she would remarry, find a man who could give her a full life, children, a home without the shadow of war. He wrote that he no longer believed Japan could win, that the Americans had too many ships, too many planes, that they replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. He wrote that he was tired. So very tired. George Yamada, reading these words in a tent lit by kerosene lamp, wept. And then he filed his intelligence report, noting no relevant tactical information, and recommended the journal for the return program. The first returns happened in 1946, months after the surrender. Through the International Red Cross and the new occupation authorities, packages began arriving in Japan. Small, carefully wrapped parcels addressed to widows, parents, siblings, the families of men who had died in the Pacific, men whose bodies were never recovered, whose fates had been listed as missing in action or killed in battle, remains unrecovered. Inside each package, a journal, a stack of letters, photographs, sometimes a watch, a lighter, a fountain pen. Always a note, in Japanese, explaining that these items had been recovered by American forces, preserved during the war, and were now being returned out of respect for the fallen. The reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then something like shock. In the propaganda they had consumed for years, Americans were demons, violent, crude, racially inferior, incapable of understanding concepts like honor or duty. The kamikazes who crashed into enemy carriers expected their remains to be desecrated, mocked, thrown overboard like trash. Soldiers who died in the jungle expected their bones to bleach under the sun, forgotten, while their spirits wandered, unable to return home. That the enemy had instead preserved their words, their photographs, their last connections to identity and family, it shattered the narrative. It introduced a dissonance that could not be easily reconciled. Keiko Takai received her husband's journal in March 1946. She was living with her parents in the ruins of Yokohama, the city flattened by B-29 firebombing, working in a textile factory for occupation scrip. She had mourned her husband, a man she barely knew, in the autumn of 1943 when the Navy telegram arrived. She had placed his photograph on the household altar, offered incense, and tried to move forward in a country that had lost everything. Its empire, its military, its sense of invincibility, its men. When the package arrived, she thought it was a mistake. Some bureaucratic error. But the handwriting on the journal's first page was his. Unmistakably his. She read through the night. And when she reached his final message to her, the apology, the permission to forget him and live, she understood something she had never expected. The Americans who killed her husband had also seen him. Not as a target, not as an enemy statistic, but as a man. They had read his fear and hope. They had cared enough to send him home, in the only way possible. Years later, interviewed by a Japanese historian researching the post-war period, Keiko said, "I hated Americans. I hated them for the bombs, for the hunger, for everything we lost. But when I held Fumio's journal, I realized they had given me the only thing that mattered, the truth of who he was. Not a hero. Not a monster. Just a man." Across Japan, in thousands of homes, the same scene repeated. Mothers received the letters their sons had written but never mailed. Fathers held the flight goggles their boys had worn into the sky. Sisters found sketches of tropical islands, drawn by brothers who would never describe them aloud. Each return was a small detonation of grief and gratitude, a crack in the edifice of post-war bitterness. People began to talk, quietly at first, about the Americans who had done this. Not the generals or politicians, but the soldiers who could have discarded these items, who could have burned them or stolen them or simply left them to rot. The soldiers who, in the middle of a war that demanded dehumanization, chose to remember that the enemy was human too. This was not universal, of course. Many journals and letters were lost, destroyed in the chaos of battle, or taken as souvenirs by men who saw them as trophies rather than treasures to be returned. The Pacific War remained brutal until its final hour. The kamikaze attacks, the casualties on Okinawa, the atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Acts of kindness did not erase acts of horror. But the journal returns became part of the collective memory, a story people told to make sense of how the war ended and the occupation began. How does a nation rebuilt by its conquerors come to terms with that paradox? Perhaps by recognizing moments when conquest was tempered by mercy, when the enemy offered something other than retribution. The program itself was small, almost invisible in the larger machinery of post-war reconstruction. Fewer than 3,000 journals and document sets were returned through official channels between 1946 and 1950. Thousands more languished in archives, unclaimed or unidentified. But the symbolic weight outstripped the numbers. In a war defined by kamikaze pilots and firebombing campaigns, by Bataan and Nanking, by racial hatred and total war, the return of these journals whispered a different story, that even in the darkest conflict, humanity could survive, unexpected and fragile, in the hands of men who chose to see beyond the uniform. The journals themselves became historical artifacts, windows into minds under extraordinary stress. Reading them now, decades after the authors' deaths, is to confront the complexity of war. Pilot officer Hiroshi Nakamura, shot down over the Philippines in November 1944, wrote extensively about hunger. Not the hunger of missing a meal, but the slow starvation of an empire whose supply lines had collapsed. He described the obsession with food that consumed his squadron, the dreams of rice cooked properly, of fish, of miso soup rich with tofu. They ate papaya and roots foraged from the jungle. They traded cigarettes for handfuls of peanuts. They grew gaunt, their flight suits hanging loose, their bodies cannibalizing muscle to stay alive. Nakamura sketched the meals his mother used to make, detailed recipes as if the act of remembering taste could sustain him. In his final entry, he wrote, "If reincarnation is real, I want to come back as an American. They have so much. They waste more than we ever had." It was a bitter admission, one echoed in dozens of other journals. Japanese pilots flying against American carrier groups saw the sheer abundance of their enemy's war machine, the endless waves of Hellcats and Corsairs, the massive fleet oilers, the supply ships stacked with crates, the evidence that America was waging war with only a fraction of its industrial capacity. They saw pilots parachuting from damaged aircraft, certain of rescue by float planes or submarines waiting nearby, while Japanese pilots knew that ditching at sea meant death because their navy had no resources to spare for search and rescue. They faced an enemy that could afford to rotate combat units back to rear areas for rest, that issued new aircraft faster than the old ones wore out, that fed its soldiers steaks and ice cream while their own rations dwindled to nothing. One pilot, whose name was redacted from the journal before return, wrote, "We fight with the spirit of the samurai. They fight with the spirit of the factory. Both are powerful, but only one can be sustained." This was the truth the journals revealed, the truth their authors had died knowing but could never speak aloud. Japan had launched a war it could not win, against an enemy whose strength lay not in martial valor but in material abundance, in democratic industrialization, in the capacity to outproduce and outlast any adversary. The kamikaze, the banzai charge, the refusal to surrender. These were not signs of strength but desperation, the final thrashing of a nation whose ideological certainty collided with logistical reality. The Americans who collected and returned these journals faced their own reckonings. Eddie Devlin, the Marine corporal who pulled that first journal from the wreckage in the Solomons, survived the war. He came home to Pennsylvania, married his high school sweetheart, worked in a steel mill, raised 3 children. He never spoke about the war except once, late in his life, to his grandson. He described finding the journal, seeing the photographs of the pilot's children, and realizing that he had killed men like this. Maybe this exact man, though he would never know. He said it didn't make the war wrong. He still believed they had to fight, had to win, but it made it sadder than he thought war could be. He kept a photograph in his wallet until he died, a creased black and white image of 2 Japanese children holding kites. His grandson asked why. Devlin said, "So I remember." Thomas Hose Hyde, the captain who proposed the return program, faced a different burden. His own family had been interned at Manzanar while he served in the Pacific, translating the words of enemy soldiers while his parents and siblings lived behind barbed wire in the California desert. After the war, he became a professor of East Asian studies, dedicated his career to building bridges between Japan and America, and never fully reconciled the contradictions of his service. He believed in the return program, believed it was the right thing to do. But he also knew it was a small grace note in a symphony of violence, a gesture that could not undo the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs, the hundreds of thousands dead. When students asked him if the journal returns mattered, he would say, they mattered to the mothers who received them. That's enough. George Yamada, the translator who wept over Fumio Takai's journal, returned to California after the war to find his family's farm confiscated, sold to pay back taxes they couldn't pay while imprisoned. He never recovered financially. He struggled with what would later be called PTSD, haunted by the voices of the dead pilots whose words he had read, whose lives he had briefly inhabited through their writing. He drank too much, lost jobs, drifted. But he kept copies of some of the journals he had translated, and late at night, when the memories were too loud, he would read them again, a vigil for men whose names he knew better than those of his own neighbors. The war marked all of them. The journals were evidence that the enemy was human, yes, but also evidence that recognizing that humanity did not make killing them any less necessary or any less damaging to the killers. This is the paradox at the center of war, that good men can do terrible things, that mercy can coexist with violence, that the same hands that pull a trigger can carefully wrap a stranger's diary for return to his widow. The symbolic object in this story is the journal itself, the physical book, paper and ink, the materiality of memory. In Japanese culture, paper carries weight beyond its practical use. Origami cranes, paper prayers at temples, the calligraphy scroll in the tokonoma alcove. Paper is a medium for the spirit, a way to make thought tangible. The pilots who kept journals were participating in an ancient tradition, the warrior poet documenting his journey, the traveler recording the fleeting world. They wrote knowing they might die, that the words might be their last testament, the only proof they had lived and thought and felt. For the Americans who found these journals, many of them farm boys from Iowa or factory workers from Detroit, the object was alien and familiar at once. Alien in its language and script, in the cultural references they couldn't parse. Familiar in its basic human function. A diary, like the ones their sisters kept, their girlfriends mailed them excerpts from, their own fathers might have written during the First World War. The act of reading someone's journal, even an enemy's, is an intimacy forced by circumstance. You see their doubts, their fears, the gap between who they pretend to be and who they are when alone with the page. And then the act of returning it, years later, across a defeated empire, through military bureaucracy and international aid organizations. That act transformed the journal from a piece of intelligence into a relic of reconciliation. It said, "We were enemies. We killed each other. But we do not have to desecrate your memory. We can return this piece of your soul. The Japanese families who received these journals often placed them on their butsudan, the Buddhist household altar, alongside the photographs of the deceased and the offerings of rice and tea. The journals became sacred objects, proof that the dead had existed, had been complex and human, had been remembered by strangers who owed them nothing. In a culture where honor and shame are intricately tied to memory and legacy, the return of a journal was a restoration of honor. Not the martial honor of the battlefield, but the deeper honor of being seen, of being mourned, of being brought home. The epilogue of this story unfolds slowly, across decades. In 1954, a memorial was erected in Chiran, Kyushu, at the site of a former kamikaze training base. The Chiran Peace Museum, as it would later be called, became a repository for the artifacts of young pilots who flew their final missions from that airfield. Among the displays, journals, letters, photographs. Some returned by Americans. Some preserved by Japanese civilians who had sheltered the pilots in their homes before their final flights. The museum did not glorify war. It simply presented the evidence of lives interrupted, dreams deferred, the unbearable human cost of ideology and empire. American veterans began visiting in the 1970s and 80s, part of the slow thaw of post-war relations. Some came seeking closure, looking for the places they had fought, trying to reconcile the enemy they remembered with the peaceful, prosperous nation Japan had become. Some came to return items they had taken during the war: flags, swords, medals, journals. They met with families, with survivors, with former adversaries. The meetings were awkward, painful, profound. Old men bowing to each other, sometimes weeping, trying to span the chasm of history with gestures and halting apologies. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, the U.S. and Japanese governments jointly sponsored a project to digitize and repatriate additional wartime journals still held in American archives. The program expanded to include letters, photographs, and personal effects. Families who had never known the details of their relatives' deaths received, half a century later, the last words those men had written. The shock of recognition, reading a grandfather's handwriting, seeing a father's face in a photograph taken days before his death, reopened old wounds but also allowed for a different kind of healing. The dead had voices again. They could speak their truth, unfiltered by propaganda or national myth. Keiko Takai, by then an elderly woman, attended one of the repatriation ceremonies. She brought her husband's journal, the one returned to her in 1946, and placed it on display with her own written reflection. Fumio was not a hero. He was not a demon. He was a young man who wanted to come home. The Americans who returned his words to me showed me that even enemies can choose compassion. This is the lesson I want my grandchildren to remember. Not the battles, not the victories or defeats, but this, that we are all human, and that humanity can survive even war. What does it mean that Americans returned these journals? On one level, it was a practical intelligence operation that became a humanitarian gesture. On another level, it was a radical act of recognition in a war that depended on dehumanization. To kill effectively, soldiers must see the enemy as less than human, as ideology, as uniform, as target. The moment the enemy becomes a person, a father, a son, a man who writes poetry and misses home, killing becomes morally complex. The Americans who preserved and returned these journals, knowingly or not, undermined the machinery of total war. They introduced doubt. They made reconciliation possible. But it was also an expression of American abundance, the luxury of mercy. A nation fighting for survival, scraping together resources, watching its cities burn, might not have the capacity for such gestures. America, fighting an ocean away, with its factories running at full capacity, its population fed, its material losses painful but not existential, could afford to think about after. could afford to preserve the enemy's diaries, could afford to imagine a post-war world where Japan was not annihilated but reconstructed, not occupied as a subjugated colony but transformed into an ally. The journal returns were a small piece of that larger vision. That democracy, that American-style liberal order, was generous enough to extend even to those who had fought against it. The Japanese pilots who wrote these journals could not have imagined this outcome. They expected to die for an empire that would last 1,000 years. They died instead for a nation that collapsed in less than 15 years of total war, and their journals came home to a Japan that would rebuild under American auspices, that would trade the militarist emperor cult for democratic constitutionalism and pacifism, that would become one of America's closest allies in Asia. Their words survived to testify to a world that no longer existed, to an ideology that had failed, but also to the universal truths beneath ideology, that men at war are terrified and brave, that they love their families, that they are capable of doubt, that they write poems even as their empire burns. In the end, the journals are about seeing and being seen. The Japanese pilots saw themselves as warriors, as servants of the emperor, as instruments of national will. They saw Americans as the enemy, as the obstacle, as the material force that would crush their spiritual resolve. But in their journals, in their unguarded moments, they also saw themselves as they truly were, young, frightened, mortal, longing for home. They saw the gap between the myth and the reality. The Americans who found these journals saw the enemy, saw the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had killed their friends, who fought with a fanaticism that seemed inhuman. But reading the journals, they saw something else too. They saw recognition. They saw that the enemy's love for family was the same as theirs, that the enemy's fear of death was the same, that the enemy's hope for a better world, though attached to a different ideology, was fundamentally the same longing for peace and meaning that drove all humans forward. And the families who received the journals decades later saw their loved ones again, not as corpses, not as statistics, not as fading memories, but as living voices on the page, complex and real. This is the power of the written word in wartime. It survives the body. It outlasts the battle. It carries the truth beyond the moment, into the hands of those who need to remember. The journals returned by Americans to Japanese families became bridges across the chasm of war, proof that even in the worst of human conflicts, the capacity for empathy, for recognition, for mercy, does not entirely die. It persists, fragile and improbable, in the hands of soldiers who could have burned these journals but chose to preserve them, in the hands of translators who could have treated them as mere data but chose to honor their humanity, in the hands of families who could have rejected them as painful reminders but chose to treasure them as the last voices of the lost. The journals came home. And in coming home, they carried a message. That war is fought between people, not abstractions. That enemies can become something other than enemies. That the work of peace begins in the smallest gestures, the quiet refusals to desecrate, the decision to see the human even when it costs nothing and changes nothing and matters only to one grieving widow holding her husband's words in a shattered city, weeping not only for what was lost but for what, impossibly, was returned. This is the legacy of the journals. Not victory or defeat, not tactics or strategy, but the stubborn, fragile persistence of humanity in the face of inhumanity. The choice, made thousands of times over by thousands of men who will never be remembered for it, to treat the enemy's memory with the same care they would want for their own, to return what was lost, to make whole, in the smallest way possible, what war had broken. And perhaps that is the truest measure of who we are, not how we fight, but how we remember, not how we kill, but what we do with the remnants, not the victory, but the mercy that follows. The Japanese pilots who flew into that furious sky never came home, but their words did. And in that returning, in that impossible grace, we see a reflection of the better angels of our nature, the part that refuses to forget, that honors the fallen even when they were the enemy, that says, You mattered. You were seen. You are not forgotten. This is the story the journals tell. And it is a story worth remembering, now more than ever, in a world that still struggles to see the humanity on the other side of the battlefield, the other side of the border, the other side of history. The journals came home. And in their coming, they whisper across the decades. We are all, in the end, just people trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to love in the face of loss, trying to believe that something endures beyond the fire and the fury and the falling. The journals came home. And with them, a truth that no weapon can destroy, that compassion is not weakness, that mercy is not defeat, and that the smallest act of recognition can echo across generations, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of war, a testament to the indestructible fact that we are, all of us, human, imperfect, broken, beautiful, and bound together by the words we leave behind.